I'm Dr. Keith Bramwell, the director of the consultants for Jamesway, and you see on here screen as well as Carolina Diaz, one of our consultants down in South America, does a lot of remote work for us, but she'll be here to monitor the Spanish side of it. We will have this translated into Spanish as well. For those that are just coming on here, if Carolina, if you want to give them a soft welcome and tell them how to get to the Spanish side of things.
Okay, sir. So, bienvenidos a todos. El día de hoy contaremos con traducción simultánea, como es costumbre en nuestros webinars. Entonces, recuerden que en la parte de abajo, en el botón del globito, pueden encontrar el botón de interpretación español. Posteriormente, compartiremos con todas las personas que suscribieron el video y la presentación. Y adicionalmente recuerden que pueden hacer sus preguntas en la caja de abajo de QIA y las estaremos respondiendo al final del webinar.
Thank you. It's kind of cool that we can do this technology wise. We have everybody in different locations and have translator and everything. So kind of cool. So our topic today, we're having Brett Rings from Kyle Vantris, a veterinarian. I've known Brett for quite a few years, and he's going to be talking to us about assessing first week chick mortality. And partly as it relates to hatcheries. And I think everybody in the hatchery business is very concerned about how we evaluate our chicks and how they're performing in the field. Everybody will get a copy of a link in the next day or two that will have a link to this video so you can watch it at a later time. We have 100 plus other past webinars that are on our library as well. So you're welcome to go look those up at any time. Unfortunately, today we can't get Brett's or Dr. Ring's camera to work, so he will be able to share his slide, but we won't get to see him. He's not too upset about that, but we'd like to have our speakers, people be seeing him talking. So with that, let's let Brett go ahead and share his screen and start. And at the end of the his session, when he's done, we'll entertain questions at that time. So go ahead and type them in the chat box or the Q&A box at the bottom, and we'll get to them when he is done. So Brett, go right ahead.
Good morning. I guess good evening. Bonjour, buenos dias, bon dia to folks here. And so glad you could be a part of this. And again, thankful for Keith inviting me. I feel real honored, and it's a pleasure and privilege. So, I know enough about a hatchery to be dangerous. So I'll let you guys know that before I get started. And then I chose this talk because, a hatchery is somewhat like a feed mill. It's an easy target for people to blame when they have high 7-day mortality or first week mortality. And I'll stop so that it can be, do I need to stop because have it translated, Keith, or can I just?
No, simultaneous translation.
Okay, simultaneous, that's good. So like I say, I think sometimes the hatchery is an easy target, but there are so many things that can affect 7-day mortality, and so we're going to kind of look at that and how can you assess it, and how can you deal with it as a poultry company. Let's see, I got to figure out how to. It's been so long since I've been in Zoom, I don't know how to advance it now. Let's see, there we go. So a little bit of the direction that we're going to take place with this presentation is one, we're going to talk about mortality influences, because there's so many things that can affect 7-day mortality. We're going to look at different tools that are available to you or to poultrymen as they look at mortality. We're going to talk a little bit about mortality patterns because that can indicate some reasons, some causes, or what might be happening. And so we'll definitely look at specific mortality causes and types, and hopefully give you guys some tools to figure this process out. So like I say, there's a lot of things that affect mortality. And so certainly the hatchery has a role, plays a big part in 7-day mortality. That bird has spent the previous 21 days in the hatchery, and so a variety of influences there through the setters, hatchers, and sanitation. What kind of machines do you have, chick holding, those things. But I want to help us to understand too, egg pack is really important in egg cleanliness, shell quality, egg storage time and holding and handling, transportation of not only the chick itself going out to the farm, but transportation of the eggs back to the hatchery. Vaccination can have a role. Certainly breeder flock age is plays a big place in chick quality, seasonality. So here in North America, for us, we have higher chick mortality in the winter and the colder months. So it makes more of a challenge to start chicks off. Certainly, there are various disease challenges. Then those disease challenges vary from different parts of the world, and so certainly immune status of those birds, feed quality, nutrition, all these factors have a role to play in when we look at first week mortality. So also, what I mean? So what are some other influences, of first week mortality? So certainly there's a big difference between broilers and breeders. They're similar but very different. And so though I'm somewhat geared more towards pullet chicks and placements, but you know what I mean. This talk, it can really fit with broilers as well, and there's a lot of similarities. So, but remember that, for those of you guys that deal with broilers, breeder chicks there's much more labor intensive in the hatchery. So, those chicks are examined and looked at many times. They're graded out and culled, and so those birds are handled for a variety of reasons, and so a lot more labor goes into that production. When you go to troubleshoot, what are some of the tools that are available to you? And so there are a variety of things that you can use. We're going to talk a little bit about chick delivery reports. Again, that's more specific for pullet chicks being placed, but there is some information on broiler chick deliveries that we can determine. Mortality chart can be a very important tool. Might list DOAs that were on that load. Also might talk about the pattern of when you look at the mortality chart over several days. It'll give you some sort of mortality pattern that we'll look at. We talk about house setup, seeing a house. How is it set up? What are the conditions like in that house? But I use the abbreviation FLAWS. So we want to look at feed, litter, air quality, water, and sanitation. So that's a tool. Chick activity can be another assessment. How do those birds act? How are they noisy? Are they active? Are they quiet? Are they subdued? Chick distribution. Is it a normal distribution? Are they huddled up together? Are they stuck against the walls? And so that's important. Chick appearance. So what do those chicks look like? You know what I mean? As you size them up, are they uneven? Are there a lot of small cull chicks in there? How well are they feathered? What's their feathering look like? Do they have a lot of yolk material on there? Are they dirty? Are their vents pasty? So, and then it's really important to do a necropsy or a post-mortem. And so that's again another tool at your disposal that you can use. And so and we'll look at some of the things. You can swab birds, you know what I mean, and take samples. And when worse comes to worse, sometimes you need to use a diagnostic lab when we need the help of somebody else when we go to look at it. So here's some chick delivery reports. And so if you'll look at this, let me see if I can use my arrow. Let's see if I can. So up here, you would have the house placement. You would have the block source, breeder block source. It'd give you the breeder flock age, and then how many chicks that are from those sources. Again, these are pullet chicks, so again more intensive, but it can give you what the vaccination program is. How were those birds vaccinated? A variety of other things that are really on this report. Where they're going to, and so this becomes really an important tool for poultrymen when they are assessing first week mortality. We said house setup is really important, and we talk about the FLAWS, or feed, light, air, litter, or water and sanitation. So, when we talk about feed, is it easily accessible? Or is there supplemental feed out there? What's the feed look like? I showing this in here. We have some feed that was pelletized that was placed for chick start, and there's no way the chick would be able to consume these pellets. So we had to have, the chicks were already placed, but we had to pick up all that feed and had to have new feed delivered to get those birds off to a good start. So do we have nice bright lights in there to get those birds started? In a lot of pullet housing, sometimes we have dimmer lighting, but do you have what we call brood lights, where you're able to brighten that house up for those first few weeks to get birds to eat and get them stimulating and growing? And so it's extremely important to have good bright lights early on in broiler chickens. What's the air quality like? Is there a lot of ammonia in the air? If you can smell ammonia, it's too high. Is it humid or is it dusty? And then most important with air quality is temperature. And so certainly we don't want those birds too hot. We don't want them too cool. We want them really just right so that they're comfortable and so they'll do the things they need to do, which is eat and find water. So again, what's your water quality like? Again, availability. Is there supplemental drinkers out there? Is your drinker height correct? Do you have enough drinkers? Do you have enough spacing between nipples? So that's really important. And of course, sanitation goes without saying. So chick appearance. So when you go in the house, what do the chicks look like? You know what I mean? And so here's some examples of some small chicks and some cull chicks, a little bit fuzzed up. Don't look particularly good. And so they're sitting down, sitting on their haunches. And so, the chicks will tell you often by their appearance, how well they are. Are they nice and spread out? You can see down in this picture in the lower left-hand corner, birds spread out on feed and on water. And so, they're doing the things that chickens should be doing. Again, they were all huddled up or pushed to the side. It would make me think something's just not right in this house. Are they too noisy? Something again isn't right. Are they just too quiet? Are they all sleeping and settled down and not active? Let the birds tell you what's going on inside them. And it's really important to on when you have a mortality issue is to open up some birds and to look at those birds on the inside and let them tell you if is there an infection inside, or is there something else going on inside that you can determine. So and use some of the tools that are available to you. A pair of scissors, a knife. Do you have sample bags to bring back tissues? Do you have bacterial swabs if there is infection, where you can take some samples to submit for culture? Do you have some formalin where if I needed to take tissues and cut into tissues and send that to a diagnostic lab for a pathologist to look at under the microscope? So that can be very helpful in determining what's the cause of our 7-day mortality. We talked about mortality charts. Again, here's some examples of some mortality charts. Certainly there'd be more details on a pullet flock chart like here, but you know what I mean? But you have broiler flock chart here, and that you can find good information on these charts. And if you look down this chart here in the bottom left-hand corner, the mortality was really good, and all of a sudden on day 5, we had a spike in the female mortality, and then a spike also in the male mortality. And so and this was for 2 different houses, and it went up. So this is a time to evaluate what's going on, as opposed to 2 other houses on that farm where there was relatively no mortality. So, but the chart can help you out a lot. So, mortality patterns. When are those birds dying? You know what I mean? Are they dying up front during that first week? Are they dying towards the end, or is it at day 3, 4? You want to know where those chicks are dying. Are they dying at one portion of the house, or are they evenly distributed throughout the house? Or is it one specific area? And in certain diseases and certain things, you might get birds dying in one particular location in a house. So this is really important information when determining what your what might be causing your mortality. And so and then you also, when you're out there and you see this, is the mortality going up? Is it going down? You want to know when did the mortality start? And then again, are birds dying faster over time? And then when I say that, are birds dying acutely? And those birds that die acutely are really fast will often have feed in the crops. So something got them very quickly and caused their death, whereas opposed to something that's more chronic and it happens over a longer period of time, those birds will often not have any food in their crop because they haven't felt well for a period of time. And so it's taken a while for them to die. When we look at first week mortality, the goal is under 1%. I know that there are some companies out there that would have a goal maybe of 0.75% or 0.7% in the first week, but typically the goal is a 1%. And so here's an example of a situation where the mortality was maybe a little bit high on the first day, but it came down pretty quickly. And this flock was less than a percent in the 7-day, and really fairly decent percent in 14-day, because I always like to see about the 14-day to be about 0.5%, and so about 1.5% 14-day mortality. And so this is well under that scale. But this would be a very typical pattern, whether it be broilers or pullets. Here's an example of a real life situation of a farm. Again, very good mortality. First week mortality, all under 1%. 2 houses are really, really good, are very good. But one house, a little bit of mortality, though it's under 1%, you see the trend of this mortality in house 3 going up. And so this is worth somebody investigating and say, why is that mortality going up? And it could, because it can continue to go up and into that second and third week if it's not corrected and not determined what the cause is. And so this is a flock that needs to, though it fits in the first less than 1% in that first week mortality, it's going up, and it needs to be further investigated. When I talk about mortality patterns too, there's certain diseases or certain conditions that chicks die from will give you different mortality patterns. And this is what I call a typical dehydration or starve out mortality, where your peak mortality is typically on the 4th or 5th day. You'll see a kind of a rise on the 3rd day, and then it'll peak on day 4 or 5, and then slowly go down over time. And so this would be very typical of dehydration or starve out mortality, and that can be confirmed by, if you do a post-mortem of the chicks, you'd be able to determine what the issue is. This is another mortality pattern. It's very typical of a bacterial infection or vaccine reaction. So it typically comes in a little bit later, and so it like I say, it might have a very good first week mortality, but you would see that mortality going up towards the end of the week and peaking into the second week. And so this would be very indicative of a bacterial infection or a vaccine reaction for those chicks. Here's a mortality pattern that is very high early. You would see very commonly with a yolk infection mortality or early bacterial. So I try to separate yolk infections from other bacterial infections because they're a little bit different. But this is one of the mortality patterns that you would see with those with the yolk infection. So causes, there are a variety of reasons that we talked about. We talked about the flaws. We talked about the microbial portion of it, and we'll talk more specifically on all these in the next coming slides. But I wanted to kind of just give you guys, again, a lot of things contributed to that, to mortality. Lameness, could be mechanical injury, maybe hatchery related, from in the setting and from the setter or the hatcher or holding. There's congenital things can happen, and then chemical and other toxicities that might influence mortality pattern in chicks. So when we talk about, the management causes for mortality, there's, again, we need to look at use our flaws and look at the house setup, and because it is so important that with houses set up correctly and it has the proper conditions to help that bird get off to a good start. So, temperature is critical. So not too hot, not too cold. Um, uh, we want but it also depends on what type of heat do you have. Are you using a pancake brooder? Are you using a box stove like here in the corner down here? Do you have tube heat, or do you have radiant brooders? And so all these different types of heaters in the chicken house have an influence and need to be managed differently in order to give the birds that right temperature and keep them from getting too hot or too cold. Air quality is extremely important. And if you use built up litter, there's a high risk for having a lot of ammonia. And ammonia can hurt your birds and get you off to a bad start. Whether too high can certainly blind birds, but also in high levels, it damages the trachea. And so birds can't get rid of dust and bacteria out of their body. And so they're more susceptible to various infections. So with it, you also want to know what's our fan time like. Are we getting good fresh air brought into the house, and maintain, is it being brought in correctly so that it mixes well and doesn't cool down and cool chicks down? Is it it's not drafty? Is it drafty in the house? We want to make sure that there's no drafts, things like that. So feed availability is extremely important. So do you have supplemental feeders out there, whether feeder lids or feeding on paper? There's a lot of different things that folks do to help supplement and make sure that birds find the feed. They got to get to that feed and water right from the get-go, right from the beginning. So other things, we talked about waters are extremely important. Are your drinkers at the right height? Do they have the right pressures? Because certainly too much pressure, the chicks can't activate the nipple. Uh, or do you have the correct type of nipple? Do you know what I mean? That has a more of a 360 action and not just an up and down action. If you're dealing, do you have supplemental drinkers out there? And so that can be extremely important. And then you've got to make sure that somebody triggers those needles before the birds are placed, so that they're not stuck where a bird can't trigger that and open that needle up when he tries to use it. So you need to make sure that those needles have been triggered and opened up correctly. So litter quality is also important. That's whether you use shavings or sawdust, rice hulls, other types of bedding that are out there. So is it good quality litter? Is it old litter, built up litter versus new litter? Is the depth correct? Because certainly if we don't use enough litter and it's too shallow, we know that birds, in the colder portions of the year can get cold, and because the litter acts as an insulation between the floor and the bird. So, and then again, how this time of year in North America and in Europe, are we getting the house pre-warmed during the colder months, and how long are we pre-warming it? We just turn them on six hours prior to the birds arrive, or we turn them on 24 to 48 hours before bird arrival, so we can get that, not just the air temperature correct, we need to get the litter temperature correct. So very important in getting birds off to a good start. Other causes, we have a lot of microbial infections that cause mortality, and certainly the primarily E. coli. That's probably in my case, probably I would say 70% of mortality I see as chicks is E. coli, but we see Enterococcus on the rise, and we're getting a lot more Enterococcus cecorum infections that are causing mortality. And so it's either in a septicemic form where you get subtle lesions on the heart. Now this heart here is a E. coli infection, but the Enterococcus infection on the heart it's more of a kind of a creamy pale white color that's on the heart. And so, but Enterococcus also, you'll find it in bones, in femoral head, and in some other bone infections, and we'll talk more about those at the lameness. So Pseudomonas can be a big issue. And whenever you have Pseudomonas, everybody's quick to blame the hatchery, but there are a lot more farm factor things that can contribute to Pseudomonas. And remember, Pseudomonas is always associated with water. And so if somebody's not cleaning hoses correctly, or they're mini drinkers or supplemental drinkers correctly, it's a high risk for Pseudomonas. And then, of course, staph and mycoplasma, uh, all less so on mycoplasma, but you know what I mean? Those are things that we still see and need to keep in our rule out list. And so, and whenever you have these things, you need to culture them. And don't forget about Aspergillus. And that can be a farm issue as well as a hatchery issue. Here's up here, you can see these little nodules that are in the lungs and air sacs of this chick here, and that was Aspergillus. Um, other types of mortality, we typically have vaccine reactions, or sometimes, some of the viral diseases, but typically in broilers, a lot of this is due to infectious bronchitis or Newcastle, or the Newcastle can exacerbate the bronchitis or other respiratory diseases. It can be further complicated by air quality if you have a lot of ammonia, or is it really dusty in the house. Those can increase your mortality and make your vaccine reaction much more harsh and compromise the bird. Certainly, immunosuppression suppression is out there. We need to worry about CAV, and we need to make sure we have good chikungunya virus protection in our birds, as well as good bursal immunity and maternal antibodies passed on to our birds, so they're less susceptible to those immunosuppressive diseases. And so, and certainly stress. Stress is, a lot of things can cause stress, everything from temperature to handling to other various diseases, to, again, the environmental conditions in that house. But stress can make that bird more susceptible to infection here. And so, and then I put these two at the bottom, inclusion body hepatitis and blackhead, are less likely, but you can see it. And in this case here, this is a 3-day-old chick with inclusion body hepatitis, and you can see this pale liver here. Now, remember, chicks, for the most part, have pale livers because they're mobilizing a lot of fat, and they mobilize that fat in the liver there, and it'll give us this pale color. But this is a case of inclusion body hepatitis in a young flock. And so, and though blackhead is less common in that first week, I have seen it in 5 or 6 days, but typically it's in a later fashion. And again, this is what blackhead looks like up here. You get these very specific target type lesions, or bullseye lesions, some people call them, and very, very characteristic of blackhead. Other causes, we can get lameness causes. So we talked about some of those things, E. coli, staph, enterococcus can cause these bone infections, primarily like femoral head necrosis, where the head of the femur, here's a normal femur head here, and this is when it breaks off. And there's been some research done to show that even when that cap comes off, when this cap right here comes off the bone, it's already early stages of femur head necrosis and femur infection. And so again, this is just bone infection in this portion of the femur. And so a lot of things can contribute to this. And same thing, here's tibia head necrosis. This is a very normal tibia head, very normal growth plate. Right here we have infection, in bone infection here in the marrow itself. And so a lot of things can contribute to this. Birds get hot, whether it be in the hatcher or in holding or transportation or on the farm, are more susceptible to these bone infections. And so we can see an increase of femoral head necrosis when birds get too hot. And there's a number of physiological things that contribute to that. That can happen. Remember, too, we can have angular leg deformities. And so, a lot of splayed leg birds. And so a lot of things can contribute to that. That can be, everything from heating in the setter and hatcher to how birds are handled at the hatchery, how birds are handled on the farm, and how well they're dumped, so that can have part to play. Here we can get infected joints, so we get staph typically, but sometimes E. coli, but in these joints, and the joints get infected, and we can also get foot lesions, and so we'll see some more of those a little bit later on. Again, we also need to think about mechanical and traumatic injuries in birds. And remember, when these birds are being processed in a hatchery, there's a lot of belts, there's a lot of things that they fall off, different chutes, and how they're processed. And so these can all become pinch points for birds that can cause some sort of injury, or can make some sort of sometimes it can even cut birds. And you can see here a toe that was injured in the process in the hatchery can even be put if boxes are stacked really hard, and you know what I mean. And it's some folks don't use papers in all their boxes, and so it's easy to pinch toes when we sometimes stack boxes. And so it's really important to look at the bird thoroughly and see where those pinch points are, and see where those injuries are, to determine where that injury might have happened at. The breeder farm, you know what I mean, has a big role to play in chick mortality. And so, it's about egg collection times. Are eggs being picked up as often as they should be? Sometimes folks skip the afternoon collection, and so in the summertime that can be detrimental to hatch into those chicks. Some people run their belts at a really high speed, and so the eggs will sometimes become cracked, or other things can rub manure on each other, so that so egg collection has a role to play. Egg pack, you know what I mean? Are they packing dirty eggs? And so this, we see this up here, and you think this is not real, but this is real. This is sometimes what you see, and this is not what we need to see. Are folks cleaning eggs, and then how are they cleaning them? That can be really detrimental. So because again, there's a lot of things that influence that egg. And so some people think they're cleaning egg, and all they're doing is just putting bacteria into the shell and pushing it into the egg. So that can be a really it can be a very negative thing when some people think it's very positive. Egg holding, again, temperature is really important. We never want the temperature to go up during the egg transportation process, and so is the temperature in our holding rooms correct? How much time are we holding those eggs? Are those eggs older than 7 days? On the farm, are folks allowing those eggs to sweat, and then when they sweat, they pull in bacteria and other things, and so as they dry and cool. So it's really important that we don't let eggs sweat. Then you see nest belts like this that are just nasty, dirty, and so that contributes to contamination. So and certainly how well people maintain their belts can affect this cleanliness of that egg. Certainly there's some things in the hatchery that have a important part. It's extremely important what goes on in the hatchery. And so the machine temperatures, set times, holding, how long are we holding those eggs before we set them? That's really important. The different types of hatch. Are we having a draggy hatch or an early hatch? We look over here. This is a chick basket I looked at that was 12 hours prior to pull, and there almost everything is hatched out. Then this is a chance for some birds that will get really what I call cooked, or get too hot in the machine, and then will often be succumb to dehydration, or to some they're weak chicks and maybe more susceptible to some bacteria, become starve outs. And so again, how quickly are chicks hatching out, and how are we pulling those chicks at the right time? And so certainly sanitation plays a big role in hatchery. And so when people bring in dirty eggs like this, like I showed you in that previous slide, that contributes to contaminating other eggs that are clean. And so also we just want to make sure that we have, our water lines are sanitized correctly, that we're using formaldehyde. If we're using formaldehyde, we're using it correctly, or using any site or disinfectant in the correct way. I guess up back here, I had down here chick temperatures. You're taking rectal temperatures, making sure that you're getting the right temperature. And so, here in North America, we use 103 to 105, and I wish I should have done that calculation in Celsius, but that's really important that we don't let chicks get too hot. And this is one way to determine if chicks are too hot. There's metabolic reasons for mortality. CITES is a big reason, and CITES is typically related to birds getting hot or birds getting cold. And in most cases, when it's young chicks and hatchery related, it's birds that got too hot. Tibia dyschondrosis, or TD, that's over here. That can be due to some metabolic effects, and certainly isn't a heritable trait. And so we as a genetic companies have tried to eliminate this, but you can still get this, especially in fast growing birds. Do we have weak chicks? With red hawks, do they have abrasions or cuts on their beak above the nostrils? What I mean? Do they have a lot of unhealed navels, or do they scabs or strings, or starve outs their small chicks? Again, a lot of things can relate to that, but the hatchery does play a role in some of these. And when we have lots of incidents of these, we need to go back to the hatchery to determine what the problem was. Again, need to necropsy chicks, just not look at them and make a decision, but open those birds up, find out, is there anything inside, what I mean, that we're missing. We need to look at that exterior of that chick really thoroughly. Look at the skins and the feathers, look at the legs and feet, look at eyes, make sure that we're not missing something that might be influencing that mortality. And then open up and look at all the major organs, what I mean, what is not normal. So I always say, let the chicks tell us what's going on. And if we look close enough, they will tell us what's happening. And then what I like to do is I like to place, as I post chicks or necropsy those chicks, I like to place them into piles or groups based on what they're dying from. So I'll put a pile that's bacterial, that where you might have air sac, infection, or the heart sac, or on the liver. And so I would put those all in a pile. You might put I'll put yolk infections in another pile, or retained yolks in another pile, dehydration in one pile, and leg issues in trauma, whatever it might be. I try to make it fairly simple, not overly complicated, but makes specific piles in specific groups. And so typically the problem is the biggest pile. And so, you might have a couple of big piles. And so there might be a couple of things going on, or the same problem might manifest itself into two different ways. And so, then if it's fairly low mortality and the piles are all relatively the same size, then usually that indicates, hey, there's nothing going on. You kind of have a little bit of everything, which we expect to see a little of everything in a normal mortality pattern in baby chicks. And so again, I assign causes to each of those pile and what contribute to the cause, and I let the chicks tell me what the problem is. And so I guess in conclusion, there are a lot of factors that can affect chick mortality. So we've gone through all those in this talk. You know what I mean? You have to play a little bit of like a detective or an inspector to determine those causes. You need to find the different clues to figure out what's causing this mortality, and use those tools to help you find the clues, and look at the various factors, whether it be the breeder flock management, or the egg handling, transportation, the hatchery, yes, but don't let the hatchery be the only thing that you focus on when you have 7-day mortality or high chick mortality. Look at farm management. We need to talk about nutrition, disease influences. What is our vaccination program like? All those things have a part to play in helping us better understand and assess 7-day mortality. So with that, that's the talk. Thank you for the opportunity to speak and to share us a few points, and hopefully this will be a benefit and a value to you. And I'd be glad to answer any questions you guys might have.
Yeah, thank you, Brett. There's a lot of questions actually, so we'll get out of those right now. You can unshare your screen.
Okay.
Actually, we could leave it on there since we
Oh,
can't
whoops.
see you, but no, that's all right. That's all right. And sure. Um, okay, so several questions, and I'll try and lump some of these together. But if somebody was sending off chicks to a diagnostic lab, and I always like to tell people to send them to an independent lab that doesn't know the history of what you've been saying. What are some of the things you would specifically ask for?
So a couple of things. One, I want to make sure that if I'm sending off labs to a lab, if I'm sending them overnight, make sure you get those birds really cool. And what I like to do is I'll put those chicks into some baggies and submerge them in ice water for a couple of hours, and then put them on cool packs and ship them overnight to a lab, or if somebody's going to transport them overnight to the lab. Uh, the other thing you can do if you're just going to keep them overnight and send them to the lab, make sure that you put them in the refrigerator, that you don't leave them out. So you want to preserve that mortality so that a diagnostic pathologist would be able to appropriately determine what's going on there. You don't want to cause any what we call an artifact, or making something look different than it really
Yeah,
is. So
yeah,
that's one thing. And then it
yeah.
depends on if I've posted some birds, what I'm seeing. You know what I mean? So I might tell them to focus on, hey, we're having, you know, maybe we're seeing plugs in the trachea or something like that. So I'll have them focus on the upper respiratory system. But I say, hey, look at, yeah, but I want them to look thoroughly throughout this bird and determine what's going on. You know, if it's I want to, but I want to make sure that they have good samples that they can take good that they have good organ preservation so that they can take good samples, for whether it be for histopathology and looking at under a microscope, whether it be to take bacterial cultures. Maybe they need to take viral cultures, and so sometimes so they can take, I might ask them to say, hey, sample the trachea of these chicks, for you know for something. So we
So you
might do
kind of
some of
lead
that.
them into a little bit
I
of
do.
some things that you
I
want,
do.
but
I try to.
you want a good assessment as well
I
from.
do.
Yeah.
And one other thing I would add, Keith, I really think that history. A good history is important for the pathologist. And so I do want to, in some ways, I want them to be independent and think on their own, but also I will lead them a little bit. I want
Okay.
to give them as much information so that they can make a good diagnosis and assessment, but two, so that they'll take the right tissues and look at the right things and test the right things. And so that's really important, because often I'll call up the lab and say, I'm sending birds, and this is why I'm sending them. This is what I'm seeing. Please see if confirm that, or is there something I'm missing, or or sometimes I can't find anything wrong with these birds. And so I'll tell them and say, have them give a thorough workup of those birds. I hope that helps.
Yeah, yeah, I think that's good thorough answer. In your chart that you had, and by the way, I love those charts that you have of the 7 days
Oh,
after. They really paint a good picture, and I know I've used those that Cobb has produced a number of times. But if when you're looking at the dehydration graph board, is that indicative of what's occurred in the incubator, the transport, or the farm, or can you tell?
I don't think you can really tell unless by age, Keith. If I see a dehydrated bird, in the first 2 days, you know what I mean? That would influence me more to a kind of a hatchery cause. If it's after that, it might be it might be farm related. You know what I mean? If
Mhm.
birds gotten too hot, have they uh, um, have they are they is water really accessible on the farm in that mortality pattern? Like I say, typically if it's hatchery related, it'll be day 3, 4, and 5. If it's if it's more farm related, that you can push that out a couple of days. And then, and so, uh, you want to assess a lot of things. You want to look at shanks. The shanks, are they all shriveled up and, on a placement? And if they are, that again, that's more indicative of a hatchery. If are there urates in the ureters, in the kidneys pale, and then what age are you seeing that? And if you see that, like I say, I would say in day 5 and below, that maybe is more of a hatchery influence. If you're seeing it at day five and later, that's probably more of a farm influence.
I know there's a lot of different factors that affect the farm or first week mortality at the farm, but we in the hatcheries have used this a lot, as a reflection of what's going on in the hatchery. What are your feelings on that and the balance between farm first week mortality and farm related issue and hatchery related issues?
So it's interesting to say that. We've kind of had a running conversation in a company in Cobb, because we keep track of 14-day mortality as well.
Yeah.
And so, and so we think we've talked, is 14-day mortality really worth for us keeping track of? Because we think of what we send folks, really it's influences them the first 7 days. After that, that's going to be more farm related. Yes, on occasion, something at the hatchery can affect them after day 7, but for the most part, it's after day 7, it's farm related. But so when we look at, I'm trying to think, if I say the question again, you said that was kind of as 7-day. Repeat your
Yeah.
question for.
Well, basically, he was just saying that we know there's a lot of other factors
Hmm.
that go along with first week mortality besides the
Oh
hatchery. I
yeah.
just want to know your opinion on that, and we use that a lot, and I think there's a lot of merit to it. And I think they were just wanting to know your opinion on the relationship between first week mortality and the hatchery and the farm.
Yeah, I think what I'll say is the hatchery has a place in the first week mortality. They definitely do, but so does the farm.
Yeah,
So it doesn't just because there's a high 7-day doesn't mean it's just the hatchery. It's the problem. Could be the farm, you know what I mean, and the farm
yeah,
management. Could be a program, you know what I mean. Is it something nutritional? I always say, if you have high 7-day as an overall company, you know what I mean, and it happens regularly on farms every week, every day, you know, there's probably a program issue. Now, is that
yeah.
program issue at the hatchery? Could be. Could it be feed nutrition? Could be. Could it be vaccination program? Could be. You know, is there, so there's a lot of
Good
things that need
point.
to be looked at in other than just the hatchery. And
Yeah,
then certainly if they're one-off situations, you know, a lot of times one-off situations, it could be a hatchery, but it also could be very much farm related, and
hmm,
and uh, because you're placing the hatchery's placed a bunch of other flocks and not had an issue, but this farm had an issue for some reason, and so you've got to really kind of again be detective and start digging in and figure out what happened. And in this day and age where you have recorders, you have equipment that can record temperatures, equipment that can record how much water birds are consuming. When fans are running, those things, it gives you a lot more. And I didn't even
yeah.
utilize some of those tools in here, but it gives you a lot more tools to determine what's going on that farm, so that again you can fully assess and determine what the issue is. Like I say, it's just easy to blame the hatchery. You know what I mean, and
Oh
and
yeah,
not have
yeah.
to do anything. And so I
You don't
I
work
think
in the
that's
hatchery, blame the hatchery. Yeah.
yeah, that's it. That's exactly it.
So what is considered normal first week mortality or acceptable, I'll even say.
Like I say, anything under 1%, I feel like is fairly acceptable. Now,
Hmm.
um, you know, and that's our goal. Do we strive for? Are we able to achieve it all the time? No. There again, a lot of things influence that. But I think that's even for a broiler hatchery, it's somewhat a little bit easier and somewhat is a little bit harder for them to achieve that first week mortality because one, the egg holding time is much shorter and usually lower in a broiler hatchery, and so you don't have that influence. However, again, you're not grading chicks and you're not going through chicks, and so you're going to have higher mortality just because you're not calling out chicks at the hatchery like a pullet, a breeder, a company is doing, and so. But at the same time, in a breeder company, in order to get some certain lines and certain flock sources, you might use a lot of flock sources, and it might be a wide age range, and you might have collected eggs over a period of time. So there's a lot of things that can negatively affect that pullet flock hatch that we try to compensate by going through and grading birds and making sure that we send the very best. So I think again, first week mortality, a goal of 1% is really good, and that's what folks should shoot for.
Yeah, I think most people do shoot for that as a general rule, and I think they were asking about different breed strains and stuff. And my experience is we're still looking at that 1%.
Yeah.
That's what we like to standard. How would nutritional of the breeders affect, or how can it possibly affect the mortality?
Well, so here recently we had a case of some rickets in a young flock that we placed, and so you know so your thoughts would go, well, why do we have rickets in it? So somehow there must have been a breeder flock effect in that they were deficient in passing on, vitamin D3, you know what I mean? Whatever little calcium was it, it didn't make it to the egg. And so, was that a feed milling error? It was certainly just a one flock issue, so, but there was something there in that breeder flock that had an influence in causing some rickets, because that's not certainly a farm thing, and that's not, we had though I think we did just to be safe, we did pick up the feed just in case and take out a new load of starter feed, but and of course send that feed off to be examined, but that has a big influence. Other things that we talk about, age of the breeder flock. We know that older hens, you know what I mean, tend to have bigger eggs. And so there's only so much calcium she puts on. So, but older hens also have thinner eggshells. So contamination tends to be higher in older flocks. So that's an issue that you always need to think about. And younger flocks, you know what I mean? I think you tend to, it's a harder shell. They're more protected, but they're typically smaller chicks. And so, that smaller chick is more susceptible to one, overheating in the machine, in the hatchery, or, overheating in holding if you don't, have good ventilation in your hatchery holding area, or it's more susceptible to even getting cold or hot when it's placed on the farm. And so again, those are some of the more specific things that I see that breeder flocks can affect first week mortality.
So kind of following up on that a little bit, with the first week mortality and all that. If you um never mind, let's go on. Let's go on with that. We've already discussed that. Okay,
Okay.
what's the difference between the causes of retained yolk sac and yolk sac infection? And what's the difference, or how do you split those two up?
I think so. Retained yolk sac. So it's what's really important when getting that. There's a lot of reasons to really get that baby. You wanting to get that baby chick on feed and water. And the first thing is not just from a nutritional standpoint and not just from a standpoint of maintaining hydration, but it's also to help with absorption of the yolk. And so birds that don't eat right away or don't drink right away or both, are there will be some interference with the yolk itself and being reabsorbed. And so again, that's why those things are so critical for those birds to get on feed. And for a lot of companies will go in 24 hours and gather chicks in various spots because you want about 95% of those birds to have feed in the crop, so that that birds got to feed and water, and that it was easily available and accessible. And so I think those are extremely important factors for absorption of the yolk. And then yolk infection, I think, is kind of a separate thing, though certainly if they don't absorb the yolks readily, they can be more prone to being infected. But I usually associate early yolk sac infection with that can be contamination. You might have exploders or what some people call them bangers in the hatchery. So you get more contamination egg contamination leads to more perhaps yolk infections. Maybe again how those eggs were handled and processed. Egg pack probably has influence in that. So those are some of the egg sanitation in the hatchery that has an effect on it. And
So
so
it can be both then,
yeah,
hatchery
it can.
and breeder
Yes.
flock can
Yep.
cause it.
Yep. Yes, sir.
Okay, a lot of questions and discussion on that, how the health of the parents relates to that or can relate to that. I mean, health of any birds always plays into
Well,
to one extent or another.
yeah. And one thing I'll say, Keith, on that, we had an issue a couple of years ago where we had birds flushing. So we had more egg contamination. You know what I mean? It was harder to maintain good egg quality because birds are flushing. They dirty more eggs. There's more, the scratch areas were wetter, feet are dirtier, nest pads are dirtier, belts got dirtier, and um, so again, those are some things that enteric health of that hen is really important in the quality of that egg she's producing. Yeah, that's what happens when you defecate and you lay an egg out the same opening. So
Yeah, we're gonna have something in there. What are your thoughts on the use of formaldehyde in the hatcheries, being a veterinarian? And I know you don't work directly in the hatcheries, but what are your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think formaldehyde is a great tool. Again, especially in the day of age when folks are wanting to use less, antibiotics in chicks for whatever reason, especially when it comes to like broilers in NAE or different antibiotic free programs. I think formaldehyde works and it's an effective bacterial and fungicide. And so when applied properly, we know that it can uh, decrease that E. coli bloom that you see late in the hatcher. And
Mhm.
so, done incorrectly or done where you jeopardize safety of team members, it there are some hazards with it, but done correctly, my my belief is that it is helpful in reducing contamination and infection in chicks.
What's the biggest area of opportunity you would see in hatcheries and sanitation and stuff um, that people maybe are just not paying enough attention to?
I think one of the things from a broiler standpoint, and I'm going back to my previous life when I was at Tyson, but is sometimes um, spending money in a hatchery and making sure that your cleaning equipment is up and running the way it should be. And primarily what I'm thinking of is like in a your boiler, your water temperature is extremely critical. And we we tell our hatcheries at Cobb we must maintain water temperatures of 140 degrees. And forgive me, I can't translate that to immediately to Celsius, but certainly, I think that would be one of the key factors because of a number of things. One, that temperature kills bacteria. Secondly, it helps clean better and facilitate better cleaning. And so, I think that's what it starts in making sure that you got egg buggies that are clean, making sure you got chick baskets that are clean, and making sure you have chick boxes that are clean, all those things that you need to maintain cleanliness in a hatchery that touches the egg or the chick. I think that's the biggest area for opportunity when it comes to broilers.
Mm-hmm. What on both, we'll let you discuss this, maybe just a couple more questions here. On both ends of the spectrum, age of the breeders, how do you anticipate that, expecting our 7-day mortality at the farm for the youngest and then the oldest as well?
Well, like I say, a lot of people don't like to have, chicks from young pullet, what I call pullet flock.
Yeah.
So, the first eggs, again, smaller chicks, they are harder to start. Are they, they require more, they require more labor and work and to make sure you get them off to a good start. Because it's so critical that they find water and feed immediately and that there is no delay. I think they're much more sensitive to temperatures, whether that be hot or cold, but typically cold. I mean, I like I like to drink a coffee or hot tea. I love hot coffee and I love hot tea. I do not like lukewarm coffee or tea. And most of the folks on this phone call could appreciate when you let a coffee, a small coffee sit out for any period of time more than 10 or 15 minutes, it's no longer hot. It becomes lukewarm. And it's the same for that little chick. So I think that's harder to get those younger chicks off to a good start because they're much more temperature sensitive and they require water and feed immediately in order to get them off to that good start. Then there are things with older, like I say, older hen flocks. Typically, the eggshells are thinner. You know what I mean? And so there's a higher risk for contamination. That chick's usually bigger. They usually don't. You know, uh, they're easier to start from a management standpoint, but they are also more susceptible, I think, to bacterial infections, whether it be egg yolk infections or air saculitis, in the heart sac becoming infected and livers getting infected. And so um, there are some differences between breeder flocks in the things and how you have to manage them.
One other question here is how do you what is your recommendation for people getting a lot of dirty floor eggs as far as setting them or not setting them or handling them?
So our rule of thumb is one, we always put floor eggs on the bottom. So, and we always identify them as, there's a word we use. Um, it's not susceptible. Uh, it's it's not suspect, but it's something along this. And we identify those as more, more problem causing. And so again, we put them on the bottom, identify it. And that way we also feel that there's less risk to them, in contaminating other eggs.
Yeah.
The other thing that we do is we have a rule of thumb. And so that any contamination beyond the size of a quarter. And so we got people in here that aren't associated with, that's probably about anything that's a bigger circumference than probably 2.5 to 3 centimeters.
Did everybody else lose the connection?
Yeah, I'm seeing
Okay.
Brett must have
Well,
got disconnected.
yep. So we'll end there anyway. I know there's a number of questions that we had a lot of questions for this topic, and if it was something that was not specific to this topic, then we skipped it. We'll address it later. Some of them we just didn't have time to address them. So we will get answers to as many of those as we can after the fact. Apologize for Brett losing his signal. I'll get with him afterwards and let them know we're okay. We wrapped up with this, but appreciate all of you coming and participating. A very good webinar. I learned a lot from it as well. A lot of really good information. I encourage you all to let some of your other people in your company that weren't able to attend watch it at a later time, because there's a lot of really good information there as we try and diagnose some hatch problems and get our hatcheries working as well as they can. So thank you all for attending. Again, you'll get a link on this so you can look at it and share it with other people, and go to our homepage and watch some of our other webinars. We've got a lot of really good topics we've covered in the past. So thank you all for being here, and hopefully you'll come back for next webinar next month. Thank you.